Radio Westeros, Episode 91, Bran Stark, Part 1.
Spoilers all books.
Hello and welcome to Radio Westeros. I'm your host, Yolkboy.
And I'm your other host, Lady Guinevere. Today, we're very pleased to present the first installment of our three-part series on Bran Stark. We're very excited to finally be covering Bran, and we have plenty to say. Today, we're going to start at the beginning and take a deep dive into Bran's story throughout the first volume of A Song of Ice and Fire.
Yes, stay tuned to hear how Bran's early ambitions to become a famous knight are shattered when Jaime Lannister, himself a knight, kicks off the story's early conflict by pushing Bran from a Winterfell tower.
But from adversity comes opportunity when the mysterious three-eyed crow appears in Bran's coma dream with the intention of teaching him how to fly. What does the crow mean by this? And what function will he serve in Bran's wider story? And what about the snippets of prophecy that are woven into the dream? We'll be taking a close look at Bran's first taste of green magic.
As Bran's internal world begins to change, so does his external one. Bran's fall and the subsequent failed assassination of the boy puts the Stark family at loggerheads with the Lannisters. Bran has to come to terms with his family splitting apart as he's thrust into a position of responsibility. We'll have a lot to say on the political backdrop of Bran's story as he becomes the reluctant Stark in Winterfell.
So, all that and much more today. But before we begin, we want to give a quick shout out to all of our patrons who help keep Radio Westeros going, including our Flaming Lightbringer patron, TJ Harrington, our Dragonsteel patron, Peter, and our Pale as Milk Glass patrons, Alex, Akka in the Company of the Cats, Chris B. the Song of Ice, Seth, Kelly, Sister Winter, Moltude, MT Walls, first of his name, and John Wergarian, as well as B-Word and Mr. J, the Bear and the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jib Jab Hot Dog Shop, house motto, we forge the chains we wear in life.
And if you want to help keep Radio Westeros strong, please consider becoming a patron of the show by visiting patreon.com/Radio Westeros. In return, there's the chance to gain ad-free access to episodes up to a week before they go public, as well as exclusive content, personalized shoutouts, and more.
And now, let's get started with our look at Bran Stark in A Game of Thrones. The morning had dawned clear and cold with a crispness that hinted at the end of summer. They set forth at daybreak to see a man beheaded, 20 in all, and Bran rode among them, nervous with excitement. This was the first time he had been deemed old enough to go with his lord father and his brothers to see the king's justice done. It was the 9th year of summer, and the 7th of Bran's life. In past episodes, we've discussed the role of prologues in epic fantasy at length. In brief, the prologue exists to make promises to the reader about the overarching narrative to come. These promises often provide the backstory, if you will, introducing events that wouldn't fit in the first chapter proper. A fantasy prologue, done well, can do a lot of heavy lifting and hooking in readers before the main narrative even begins. In writing circles, the Game of Thrones prologue is often held up as an example of the gold standard for such a narrative structure.
The functions of the prologue are subtly different from those of the first chapter, which has other jobs to set the scene, introduce main characters and conflicts, and lay the groundwork for the triggering incident of the story. In fantasy, characterization takes center stage along with setting in the form of world building because compelling characters can make a reader want to know more about the newly introduced fantastic setting. George R.R. Martin is a master with both of these tools in the authorial toolkit.
In Bran 1, as we'll see, 7-year-old Bran Stark is established as a main character. The events of his second point of view chapter will be one of the inciting incidents of the conflict between Stark and Lannister that will define much of the first volume of the series, and ultimately most of its second and third as well. But Bran's first chapter establishes the values of House Stark and the honor of its titular head, Lord Eddard, as being apart from and in contrast with those of the king. When Ned receives his own call to adventure in the novel's fourth chapter, those values will become the foundation for future conflict with King Robert and others, as well as Eddard's eventual downfall at the hands of Queen Cersei and House Lannister.
And so, whereas the Game of Thrones prologue introduces the supernatural horror that will become the major fantasy conflict of the series, Bran I introduces us to characters and sets the stage for the political conflict that will be the main focus of the first installment in the series. As a low-level magic fantasy narrative, George often keeps the existence of magic and the supernatural off-page for long stretches of time, mirroring the experience of in-world characters who have little to no day-to-day experience with the fantastic, and so long stretches of his series appear to be concerned mainly with the political strife of the various factions.
It's also worth noting that George wrote Bran's first chapter first. While perhaps the idea of the first chapter in a book being written first doesn't sound earth-shattering, it's not always the way a novel takes shape. But in this case, George was evidently given a vision from his creative brain, which he felt compelled to put on page, that eventually became Bran I. Here's his description of the process.
It was 1991. I was actually writing a science fiction novel that I had been intending to write for some time. And just one day, the first chapter of A Game of Thrones came to me, the scene where they find the direwolf pups in the summer snows. That was the first scene that I wrote. That scene came to me, and I wrote it in, 3 days. It just poured out of me. It was a scene that haunted me. The characters seemed so real. I knew right from the beginning, that first sentence. They find the direwolf pups in the summer snows. I knew they were the summer snows. So this was a place where it snowed even in summer. So what could result in that? And wheels started turning. What kind of world would have that? Where do these people live? What is the rest of the kingdom like? And the world building grew parallel to the story. I'm writing a story and someone makes a reference to some king who has been dead 100 years. And I threw a few of those in, and then I said, I better write a list of all these kings or I'm going to start contradicting myself. So I wrote a list of the Targaryen kings and the names of their reigns, and at some point I said, I better have a map. So I sat down and I drew a map, all while I was still writing the story.
George has told a version of this story many times over, our favorite being the one where he adds, I knew I was lost when I started drawing maps. But all versions agree that it began with the characters finding direwolf pups in the summer snows. And summer snows would turn out to be a key element in the world building of Westeros, while the direwolf pups themselves would become an integral part of the narrative, along with the family who first discovered them.
With all of this in mind, let's walk through Bran I, keeping in mind the work the chapter is doing in introducing the story to the first-time reader, as well as teasing out the little hints that we can see only as rereaders. The chapter begins with the description of the weather and a more prosaic statement about the action that will be taking place. It specifies that it's late summer and that young Bran is going to see a man beheaded, the king's justice being delivered to an as yet unnamed individual by a group of men which includes Bran's father and his brothers.
It's the final sentence of the first paragraph that hints at the strangeness of Westerosi seasons. It was the 9th year of summer and the 7th of Bran's life. We'll get used to hearing Bran and other innocents called sweet summer child, but right here in the first paragraph, George defines what that means. A sweet summer child has never experienced winter, nor the hardships that inevitably accompany it.
This isn't the first reference to Westeros' seasons being askew, but in the first, from the prologue, was more subtle. Garad, who our prologue POV Will thinks has been 40 years on the wall, mentions last winter and the one before, when I was half a boy. The reader can be forgiven for not stopping to pass that offhand comment due to the conflict that swirls between the human characters and later their supernatural adversaries throughout the chapter. Bran 1 spells it out for us. The world our characters live in has experienced 9 years so far of summer. Weird. Let's read on.
In the next paragraph, we learn more about the so-called wildlings and the lands beyond the wall, the setting of the prologue. The reader knows what horrors lurk there and can guess what ghouls old Nan might be referring to, but we also have the first mention of a king, Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. Is he man or ghoul? While Bran's fear might suggest the latter, the fact that his subjects, the wildlings, are described as men suggests the former. We're also introduced to something called the Long Night and told that the others, from the prologue, were part of it. More intrigue.
We then get a description of the man the party has come to execute. He had lost both ears and a finger to frostbite, and he dressed all in black, the same as a brother of the Night's Watch. Because our attention in the prologue was specifically drawn to his injuries from frostbite, readers can now guess that the man Bran is going to see beheaded is Garrett, the Night's Watchman last seen guarding the horses on Waymar Royce's orders in the prologue. The words, "except that his furs were ragged and greasy," are a hint that Bran, young as he is, might have an idealized view of the Night's Watch, perhaps similar to that held by Waymar Royce, who came from the same social class as Bran and, as we saw in the prologue, dressed very differently from Garrett.
In the next several paragraphs, we're introduced to more of the party. Bran's father, Eddard, his brothers, Robb and Jon, and their father's ward, Theon Greyjoy. Bran thinks about the contrast between his private father and the public face he wears in his capacity as Lord of Winterfell. We surmise that Winterfell is their home, and the banner of House Stark is described as a grey direwolf racing across an ice-white field. Bran also describes the ceremonial sword of House Stark, Ice, as Valyrian steel, spell-forged and dark as smoke. This is the first hint in the main story that magic is an accepted part of this world, as well as the introduction of Valyrian steel as something extraordinary.
We also get to witness Lord Eddard Stark talk to Garrett, but whatever passed between them is cloaked by our observer's youth. There were questions asked and answers given there in the chill of morning, but afterward Bran could not recall much of what had been said, it says, which is a clever device George uses to obscure details he doesn't want to reveal just yet. Much later, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch will mention Garrett to Tyrion Lannister in a way that implies that whatever Garrett told Ned, he failed to confirm the deaths of his two companions. Did he also fail to mention the appearance of the others and the bizarre circumstances that led to his desertion? That's something we think we won't get an answer to until Bran's uncle Benjen returns to the page, if ever.
The execution was stated to be the goal of the party at the chapter's outset, and as it plays out, the cast of characters grows. We meet Jory Cassell, captain of Lord Eddard's Guard, and the king whose justice is being rendered is named as Robert of House Baratheon. For the reader, this illuminates Waymar Royce's last words in the prologue, "For Robert." The absent king has had two things done in his name so far: Waymar's last stand against a supernatural enemy, and now the execution of Waymar's surviving companion by the Warden of the North, Eddard Stark.
As the execution plays out, we get another hint about the climate in this world. Whereas the weather was initially described as clear and cold, having a crispness that hinted at the end of summer, when Garrett's head is severed from his body, it's revealed to the reader that it's not just cold, there's snow on the ground, certainly a curiosity in most people's experience of summer. We also learn that Bran's brother Jon is a bastard. He's shown to be a role model and an old hand at justice at the age of 14, giving his younger brother advice, praise and encouragement. Jon is described using language that is simple, honourable.
Bran notices that Jon isn't amused by their father's ward, Theon's behavior. Jon's reaction when the 5 years older Theon laughs and kicks the dead man's head away from where it fell in the snow, the single word ass, reveals a seriousness in the youth and sets up a potential conflict between the two. It also implies more about Theon than his actions tell, since we have to assume that the two young men knew each other well.
With the execution finished, the party begins what's described as a long ride home. Bran is witness to a good-natured disagreement between his two brothers about Gered, who Robb calls the deserter. Robb saw courage in the quiet acceptance of his fate, but Jon saw something else. No, it was not courage. This one was dead of fear. You could see it in his eyes, Stark. Both of Bran's brothers are described in this passage, and it's a description of contrasts, with Robb having the look of his mother's family, the Tullys, while Jon is described in a way that we'll soon come to know as the Stark look. Robb and Jon are apparently the same age, which we'll eventually know is the foundation of Bran's mother's anxiety about her husband's natural son. She views his existence as a threat to her eldest son.
But for his part, even in this brief scene, Jon takes pains to identify Robb as Stark. While the pair seem to arrive at an agreement that Gered died well, as with his comments on Theon Greyjoy, we see Jon as extremely observant. Bran thinks that there was little his eyes did not see. And in fact, Bran also seems to have noticed Gered's eyes, and he thinks about what his brothers said as they race away. When his father appears at his side, Bran's lost in thought. He tells Eddard about the disagreement between Robb and Jon, and when his father asks what he thinks, Bran replies with a question, no doubt the thing that had been consuming his thoughts. Can a man still be brave if he's afraid?
Eddard's answer, that is the only time a man can be brave, is one of the philosophical underpinnings of the Stark family story, bravery in the face of fear being the only true bravery, according to their father. Time and again, as the story progresses, we'll see the Stark children behaving with true bravery in the face of unknown and unanticipated fear. But Lord Stark isn't done with lessons and asks his son if he knows why he executed the man.
Bran misunderstands the question and in so doing reveals his misunderstanding of the situation. His father tells him that no, the man wasn't a wildling, smiling a little at the obvious influence of the nursemaid known as Old Nan. What he was a deserter from the Night's Watch, and Ned takes the time to explain why that is so dangerous. No man is more dangerous. The deserter knows his life is forfeit if he is taken, and he will not flinch from any crime, no matter how vile. There's quite a bit of future irony involved in that statement, but in the moment it serves mostly to reinforce the picture of Lord Stark as a man of rigid honor with a stern and unyielding sense of justice.
But, adds his father, the question wasn't why the man had to die. That should be self-evident. The question was, why did Lord Eddard deliver the justice himself? The answer to that question is another opportunity to expand on the world the author is building, particularly with some exposition about House Stark. Ned declares that the Starks have the blood of the first men in their veins, which is implied to be an older bloodline that sets them apart from others in the realm, including, as we'll see, the king. Ned continues, we hold to the belief that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. If you would take a man's life, you owe it to him to look into his eyes and hear his final words. And if you cannot bear to do that, then perhaps the man does not deserve to die.
We just heard Robert Baratheon's titles enumerated as King of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, so we can infer that the realm contains multiple ethnic groups. And Ned also tells Bran that yes, King Robert uses a headsman to deliver his justice, as did his predecessors of House Targaryen, another seed of world building planted for the author to expand upon later. And Ned goes on to speak to Bran's expected future, holding a keep for his brother Robb, now confirmed to be Ned's heir, and needing to know this lesson and to be able to dispense justice in Robb's and the king's names because, quote, a ruler who hides behind paid executioners soon forgets what death is. Ned casts some real shade on King Robert and lays the groundwork for future conflict with that statement.
This lesson is another core principle of House Stark, one which will see Ned holds dear and that his children have been well instructed in. Jon and Robb are stated to be old hands at justice, and so it's no surprise that they've both already internalized this lesson and will manifest it in their futures. But we'll also see Bran's sister Arya taking it to heart, and we assume that Bran, having learned his lesson early and well, will one day put it into practice. We can also speculate that someday Sansa too will show that she was paying close attention to their father's lessons.
Finally, near the midpoint of the chapter, we arrive at that first scene that captured George's imagination when his subconscious delivered it to him, apparently fully formed. Not only is this scene the inception point of the entire series, it also injects a sense of excitement into the narrative, which so far has been a solemn occasion, with the execution followed by Ned's philosophical lessons to Bran.
The late summer snows, one of the first details to come to the author about this world, are said to be knee-deep, and in that snow Bran's brothers have made a discovery. Jon Snow rides excitedly back to the main party with a summons. "Father Bran, come quickly, see what Robb has found." And as the rest of the group hurry forward, we get a hint. Robb is described as cradling something in his arms, followed by a shock. There's a dead wolf lying there that has Jory Cassell and Theon Greyjoy reaching for their swords.
The shock, it turns out, is due to the beast's size. In Bran's thoughts, it was bigger than his pony, twice the size of the largest hound in his father's kennel. With clever word choice, the author offers a couple more hints about the discovery. Robb refers to the dead creature as she, and he is once again described as holding a bundle, a word often used for infants, in his arms. So the reader can begin to guess that the older boys have discovered a baby wolf.
As to the shocking size of the wolf, in due course it's revealed to be a dire wolf, which was previously stated to feature on the banners of House Stark. Jon Snow provides the information calmly, meeting Theon's disbelief about the likelihood of seeing a direwolf south of the wall, which we still don't know the exact location of relative to this scene, with a simple statement of fact. "I see one now."
Bran views the huge and very dead direwolf with apprehension until he notices what was causing his brother's excitement. The bundle Robb was holding delighted Bran, and within moments Jon had lifted a second pup into his arms and informed his little brother that there are 5 puppies there in the snow.
The adults in the party were neither charmed nor delighted. For some, like Jory Cassell and Hullen, the newly introduced Master of Horse, it seems clear that a direwolf abroad in the lands south of the wall, and a dead one at that, is a bad sign. Ned declines to agree with their superstition, and yet Bran describes his father as seeming troubled. When he wonders aloud what killed the beast, Robb directs him to an object embedded in a jaw. Ned investigates and comes up with, quote, "a foot of shattered antler, tines snapped off, all wet with blood."
Bran doesn't understand the silence and unease that follows this discovery, but readers will soon enough. While the direwolf is the symbolic representation of House Stark, the stag, antlers and all, is the symbol of House Baratheon, the royal house. In spite of his brisk dismissal, Ned will have a hard time curbing the superstitions of his men, and in the very next chapter, when his wife comes to tell him that the king himself is coming north to visit Winterfell, she'll think with dread about the talk in the yards, a direwolf dead in the snow, a broken antler in its throat.
Getting back to Bran's chapter, we swiftly learn that as much as symbolism can be viewed with dread, it can also be manipulated to achieve a desired outcome. when the men of the household, Hullen, his son Harwin, Jory Cassell and Theon Greyjoy, speak of killing the wolf pups, Bran is distraught, and Robb tells them haughtily to stand down. Ned seems conflicted, but it's Jon Snow who cleverly comes to the rescue, using the very symbolism that had upset his father's retainers to persuade Ned that his children were meant to have the pups. Lord Stark, there are 5 pups, 3 male, 2 female.
Whereas moments before Jon had been addressing Ned excitedly as father, he now uses a formal mode of address, Lord Stark, and continues, "You have 5 true-born children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. The direwolf is the sigil of your house. Your children were meant to have these pups, my lord." The glances exchanged by the household men speak volumes about Jon's statement. It says that Bran loved Jon with all his heart at that moment because even a 7-year-old could see the sacrifice his brother had made. By setting himself, the bastard, apart from his true-born siblings, and including the 2 girls and the smallest boy, who weren't even present, he made the discovery of the pups seem like fate, perhaps a gift from the gods themselves.
This passage reveals much about the Stark family. First, the size of the family is stated, along with Jon's place in it. Traditions around bastardy begin to be defined, and we can make a lot of judgments about Jon Snow's character. He is subtle and able to manipulate situations with ease, but he does so out of love and without selfishness. His own gain or loss matters little if he achieves what he sees as the correct outcome, in this case, saving the pups and supporting his brother's wishes to keep them.
Ned presses Jon about his own wants, and Jon replies, "The direwolf graces the banners of House Stark. I am no Stark, father." Bran describes his father as thoughtful about this statement, and only in hindsight does this line stand out. But with hindsight, it stands out a lot. It's quite true that Jon's surname isn't Stark, but as most readers guess, neither should it be Snow. Although no matter what his surname is, Jon is half Stark, and he looks it, even if it turns out to come to him somewhat differently than first described.
There followed a rush of bargaining, promises and instructions between Ned and his sons. After their father was satisfied with the terms, the other 3 pups were collected and the party began to head homeward once more. But as they started to ride away, Jon, and Jon alone, heard a noise. It says, he swung his horse around and galloped back across the bridge. They watched him dismount where the direwolf lay dead in the snow, watched him kneel. A moment later, he was riding back to them, smiling.
Jon had found a 6th pup, one that had crawled away, or, as their father suggested, been driven away, because this one was different. His fur was white, where the rest of the litter was gray. His eyes were as red as the blood of the ragged man who had died that morning. Bran wonders at the open eyes of this one, given the other 5 were still birth-blind. And what the reader doesn't yet know is that red eyes and white coloring is similar to the weirwood trees that personify the old gods of the north. And given that, we have to wonder what Ned and the other adults thought of this.
And there's more curious symbolism about this pup. First, he was male, and so still fits the schema that Jon had laid out regarding the fateful discovery of the pups. His open eyes mirror Jon's own, which have been described as noticing everything. And the coloration has another significance. Whereas the first 5 pups are described as grey, matching the direwolf of House Stark as shown on its banners, this one is white. In heraldry, a bastard is not allowed to bear their father's arms, but there is a tradition that some noble bastards, think House Blackfyre, with their black dragon, would take their father's arms and reverse the colours. So, as a Stark bastard, there's a chance that Jon might one day take a white wolf on a grey field as his own arms, in which case this pup is highly symbolic of that possibility, and this in fact makes him fit into Jon's schema for the pup's existence even more snugly.
The chapter ends with Theon Greyjoy commenting that an albino pup would, quote, die even faster than the others, followed by Jon's reaction, described as a long, chilling look, followed by, I think not, Greyjoy. This one belongs to me. There's some further groundwork laid for future tension between Jon and Theon, as well as perhaps some background tension being subtly hinted at. It's clear the two don't see eye to eye, and we can imagine that the nobly born Theon Greyjoy, Lord Eddard's ward, might have tried to use his social status to jockey himself into a higher position in the household than the bastard Jon, whereas Jon would likely reciprocate by using his own status as Ned's son and Robb's half-brother to do the same.
Additionally, while it's far too soon to tell for the first-time reader, there's some irony upon a reread about Theon's assumption that the albino will be the first to die, in light of the fact that the only people identified as albinos in the series, Brynden Rivers and the Ghost of High Heart, are also amongst the longest-lived individuals in the story.
And we come to the end of the first chapter with House Stark established as the main players in the series, and 2 of George's 5 major characters introduced. We've learned about their environment with its summer snows and their beliefs, with sigil-based superstition hinted at and Lord Eddard's philosophy of leadership defined. We also have some hint as to conflicts to come, with the king, who we'll soon learn is a childhood friend of Ned's, being placed in opposition to the Starks both philosophically — he's a leader who hides behind paid executioners — and symbolically, the antler in the dead direwolf. And the presence of the Night's Watchman Garrett ties the supernatural events of the prologue into the main story, however tenuously.
Up next, we'll see what happens in Bran's second chapter when the political conflict facing House Stark takes centre stage, and Bran falls into his own destiny.
The hunt left at dawn. The king wanted wild boar at the feast tonight. Prince Joffrey rode with his father, so Robb had been allowed to join the hunters as well. Uncle Benjen, Jory, Theon Greyjoy, Sir Roderick, and even the Queen's funny little brother had all ridden out with them. It was the last hunt, after all. On the morrow, they left for the south.
Bran's second chapter begins, as his first one did, in the morning. Now, though, the action is leaving Bran behind as his father and brother Robb join the king and his party on a boar hunt, a relatively trivial pursuit in comparison with the solemn act of upholding the king's laws and justice that we saw in the first chapter. We're beginning to see more of the contrast between Robert Baratheon, who is not an altogether serious man, with his childhood friend and chosen hand, Ned Stark, who is consistently represented as thoughtful, honourable, and driven by duty to his family, his house, the North, and yes, his king.
On another note, Robert's fondness for boar hunting is established in the first passage. The fact that the Queen exploits that habit for her own benefit in this chapter might just be a tiny bit of foreshadowing of events yet to come in King's Landing. While this chapter begins by suggesting that Bran will be on hand to witness those future events in King's Landing, the thing is, George doesn't want Bran to go to King's Landing. Although we can only know this on a reread, Bran's character arc bends northwards, and his destiny is tied to events taking place beyond the Wall.
Yet while the first-time reader doesn't know it yet, the symbolism of the hunt leaving Bran behind foreshadows this fact. His father and the king's party will ultimately once again leave him behind at Winterfell, which will turn out to be, from a narrative perspective, absolutely necessary. With Ned, Tyrion, Jon, Arya, Sansa, and eventually even Catelyn leaving, we'll need a POV character at Winterfell for the foreseeable future, and so George cannot allow Bran to leave.
In the beginning, though, in spite of being left behind on this day, Bran is mostly excited. As far as he knows, he'll be leaving the only home he'd ever known the very next day, heading south with his father and sisters and the royal party. His innocence and naivete are on display as he thinks about traveling with the king and his Kingsguard, whom he believes to be inherently honorable and noble men. And with his father being Hand of the King and living in a castle, it's all just like something out of one one of Old Nan's stories. In fact, while much will later be made of Sansa's fondness for stories and romance, for much of A Game of Thrones, Bran is hands down the Stark who thinks the most about a full spectrum of fanciful tales, from the macabre to the romantic. As much as, if not more than, his sister, Bran wants to grow up to become a character in a story.
One thing Bran cannot understand is why his brother Jon seems angry. Poor sweet summer child that he is. As far as Bran can see, going to the Night's Watch was, quote, almost as good as going south with the king. Of course, the reader has the benefit of knowing exactly why Jon seems angry, and even more to the point, we can begin to guess how very little glamour there will be to life at the Wall, though we have yet to actually see Castle Black or meet most of its inhabitants. As in Chapter 1, we can see a through line from Bran's view that the Watch is a noble calling, worthy of dreams and songs, to what was likely the view of Waymar Royce.
And what we see through Bran's thoughts are his own dreams, and even his certainty that he would grow up to be a knight one day, and better yet, a knight of the Kingsguard, which in his mind was the pinnacle of honor. Rather than contemplate the reality of serving the likely next king after Robert, his awful son Joffrey, Bran thinks about all the legendary Kingsguard from the stories, and in particular of the living legend Sir Barristan Selmy, the current Lord Commander of Robert's Kingsguard. He thinks about the two Kingsguard who had come north with Robert, Sir Boros and Sir Meryn, neither of whom feels very impressive. Sir Jaime Lannister, who is actually the third Kingsguard in Robert's party, looks the part, but as Bran thinks, Robb said he had killed the old Mad King and shouldn't count anymore.
As we'll soon see, Ned shares his son's doubts about Sir Jaime. Unfortunately for Bran, we'll see even sooner that those doubts are well-founded. In the moment, there's a very interesting historical callback here to a Stark ancestor who was called upon to sit in judgment of the men responsible for killing another Targaryen king at the end of the Dance of the Dragons. During the famed Hour of the Wolf, Bran's ancestor, Lord Cregan Stark, condemned to death not only the Kingsguard, who had failed in their duty to protect the unworthy King Aegon II, but also all of the lords and residents of the Red Keep who were even remotely connected to his death. Given everything that follows from this chapter, we have to wonder how much that historic example weighed on Bran's father's mind as he reflected on his missed opportunity to insist that the justice of the North be meted out in King's Landing all those years ago when Sir Jaime killed the old Mad King.
In this chapter, Bran is supposed to be saying his farewells. While this was likely meant to apply to the people of Winterfell, it seems the emotional weight of those farewells, along with the trauma of leaving everything he's ever known, was too much to bear, and so Bran retreated to the Godswood with his wolf pup. Although his as yet unnamed pup was clearly smarter than any of the hounds in his father's kennel, he couldn't convince it to fetch sticks, and so eventually Bran grew bored and turned to an activity that no doubt was meant to bring him comfort and closure, climbing the walls of the ancient castle he called home.
We get to see Bran avoiding the eyes of the heart tree in the Godswood, which was introduced to us in Catelyn's first chapter. Bran seems to have an uneasy relationship with the gods of the North, as he thinks trees ought not to have eyes, or leaves that looked like hands. But in spite of being out of sight of the tree, there is one pair of eyes that follows him and seems intent on offering some sort of warning, although Bran interprets it as akin to his mother's disapproval and chooses to ignore the wolf pup as he pulls himself onto the armory roof. It's our first hint that the wolf relationship might be more than it seems.
Up on the roof, we learned that, quote, the rooftops of Winterfell were Bran's second home, and that he could, quote, climb before he could walk. So this labyrinth of walls and towers and courtyards and tunnels is where Bran will say his true goodbyes, in the process of which we'll get our first in-depth descriptions of the great stronghold of the North. We're also served a little bit of prefiguring with statements like, his mother was terrified that one day Bran would slip off a wall and kill himself, and Old Nan told him a story about a bad little boy who climbed too high and was struck down by lightning, and how afterward the crows came to peck out his eyes. The first serves to establish that Bran falling will come as no surprise to his family, and so what actually happens in this chapter will pass unnoticed. The second is a neat little bit of foreshadowing to not only what will happen to Bran in this chapter, but in his next one as well. It's also established through a description of how he excelled at going unnoticed above everyone's heads, that Bran enjoys secrets and being invisible, which might also be highly relevant to his future arc.
It was when he approached the long-abandoned first keep that he heard voices. A man and a woman were inside the tower, having a conversation about his father. Previously, Bran's youth was a shield the author could use to cloak things he wanted to remain unsaid. Now it becomes a device to elaborate on something he wants us to know, but without any input from the POV character. We essentially get a window onto Jaime and Cersei that is without opinion or judgment, thanks to Bran not fully understanding what he is seeing and hearing. There are no other POV characters in a Game of Thrones who could accomplish this.
The reader's interest is piqued since, as adults, we can infer more about what might be going on than the 7-year-old Bran can. Nonetheless, Bran understands some of the things they're saying about his father and decides he'd like to hear more, even though their words frighten him. As the conversation between the unseen pair continues, the first-time reader likely cannot draw any more conclusions than young Bran, although it does seem obvious to us that the pair are the Queen and her brother Sir Jaime. Bran still isn't sure, and although he's frightened, he decides he has to see who's talking before he leaves the way he came to bring this story to his brothers. And so he slowly and carefully positions himself so that he can see inside the window. And what he sees is worse than the overheard conversation, and far more dangerous.
It's like the classic one last case trope in detective stories. Bran's planned to leave, but only after he collects one last piece of information, feels deeply ominous, especially after he recognizes the woman is the queen. Catching a queen in flagrante delicto is a dangerous place for anyone to be. But to be a child who does so while balancing perilously upon a rooftop high in the air and simultaneously recognizing that the queen and her lover looked as much alike as reflections in a mirror is particularly dreadful.
Although to Bran's innocent eyes, what he saw was wrestling, albeit while naked, it must have been obvious to the occupants of the tower that he had also heard some things. The woman seemed much more concerned about what he saw, though, which the reader can now connect with the conversation Bran overheard. The queen is having an affair with her own brother, a knight of the Kingsguard, and they were discussing her fears that the prior hand, Jon Arryn, had learned of it, and that the new one, Ned Stark, would as well.
In a moment of panic, Bran slipped and almost fell. The man, Sir Jaime, appeared at the window with the queen and pulled him up to the sill. But even as Bran feels relieved, still not realizing the danger he was in, Jaime reacts to 3 words Cersei had said as he reached for the boy's hand. He saw us. It says he looked at the queen with loathing before pushing the 7-year-old off the windowsill with the unforgettable phrase, "The things I do for love."
Bran's fall, as his wolf pup howled in the Godswood and crows circled the tower, is the inciting incident of A Game of Thrones, and arguably the series, or at least its first 3 volumes. The eventual discovery that the Lannisters were involved in Bran's fall will lead to other, bigger discoveries, and eventually to war. In storytelling, the first act ends when the characters go beyond a point of no return, in many cases leaving home or attaining knowledge that cannot be ignored. For the story as a whole, this chapter marks the beginning of the end of the first act, as one by one, all of Bran's family members will begin their journeys to the point of no return over the next several chapters. For Bran, this chapter may likely be considered the end of his first act in A Game of Thrones. What comes next will be an intermezzo of sorts, followed by a life that, to Bran, will be almost unrecognizable from what came before. It seemed as though he had been falling for years. "Fly," a voice whispered in the darkness. But Bran did not know how to fly, so all he could do was fall. Maester Luwin made a little boy of clay, baked him till he was hard and brittle, dressed him in Bran's clothes, and flung him off a roof. Bran remembered the way he shattered. "But I never fall," he said, falling.
A lot happens at Winterfell and beyond following Bran's fall, including, as foreshadowed by the hunt leaving Bran behind in his previous chapter, Ned and the girls departing for King's Landing along with the royal party. Their departure essentially closes the window on Bran's romantic dreams of living in the capital, becoming a knight, and joining the King's Guard. His dreams and his future will be much darker now, and the stories he leans into going forward will increasingly be of the bleak and existential sort, as we'll see in his very next chapter.
Ned and the girls aren't the only ones who leave Winterfell, though. Jon Snow journeys to the Wall along with Tyrion Lannister, with whom he'll form a bond of sorts that will eventually bring Tyrion back to Winterfell and briefly back into Bran's story. And perhaps most significantly, Catelyn has also departed, accompanied by Sir Rodrik Cassel, headed south to warn Ned about what she has perceived to be a Lannister plot, following the attempt on Bran's life by a cat's paw wielding a Valyrian steel dagger.
From a writer's perspective, Kat's departure serves to further expand our viewpoint on what's happening around Westeros. We start with 8 POV characters in A Game of Thrones, and 7 of them are located at Winterfell. But in order for the reader to gain perspective on George's world, those characters must move outwards along with the story. After Cat leaves, Bran is the only POV remaining at Winterfell. Catelyn will never return as promised, and aside from the tragedy that represents to her children in the story, this is highly significant in the mechanics of Bran's arc. For child characters to be successful, they must be given agency, and one of the key tools authors use to achieve this is to remove parents and other adult mentors from that child's orbit. Self-directed problem solving is important for characters of all ages, but doubly so for extremely young characters, especially those whose internal POV we are given.
George has often spoken about Bran being the most difficult character for him to write due to his very young age, as well as the magical aspect of his arc. In fact, Bran's age, and likely his sister Arya's as well, may have been one of the big drivers of the notorious 5-year gap, with George making comments like, "Writing Bran should be easier in the next book, I would think, with the 5-year break. Then I'll have a 14-year-old, and in terms of the 7 Kingdoms, that's almost an adult."
And so, when George says he finds writing Bran difficult, perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that a chapter consisting largely of the boy's dream world works out to be the shortest chapter in all of the saga at just under 1,700 words. We might imagine the author scratching his head, wondering if he needs to make it longer, but then settling on the notion that a shorter chapter works just fine in this instance. This is Bran's coma dream, so George can throw the rulebook out the window.
Ultimately, this chapter is an awakening that works on multiple levels. By the end, Bran is literally going to wake up from his coma, which from a story perspective he must do, given that he's now our only point of view for Winterfell. But not before having his third eye pecked at by a mysterious dream companion in the form of a crow. George put Bran in a coma to change him, When the boy wakes up, he'll be physically disabled, but following this dream sequence, he can begin his journey as a practitioner of psychic abilities.
While Bran, falling through the sky in his dream like a skydiver with no parachute, believes he will wake up before the impact, George ups the ante by conveying that this is a crossroads for Bran. The crow informs him, rather nonchalantly, that his fate rests on the outcome of the dream. "I'll wake up when I hit the ground," Bran told the bird. "You'll die when you hit the ground," the crow said. It went back to eating corn.
So early on, the stakes are raised quite high to give us a ticking clock for dramatic tension, with the crow telling Bran that he must either fly or die. And who better to tutor the young boy on the art of flying than a crow? It's clear from the outset that this strange character is acting as a guide or teacher to Bran, and the reader might wonder if this is a one-off dream character or something more.
And the latter turns out to be true, as we later learn that the crow is in fact missing Night's Watch Lord Commander and all-around legendary historical character Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, aka in this instance the Three-Eyed Crow. Bloodraven was lost north of the Wall nearly 50 years ago and has become a greenseer in a remote cave aided by the remnants of a Children of the Forest community. As a greenseer, he can tap into the Weirwood network to glimpse past, present, and possibly future. As a green dreamer, he might experience prophetic visions, and as a skin changer, he can control animals like direwolves and, well, crows.
Yeah, green seeing is an intriguing magical aspect to George's world, and George wants to deliver a slice of that magic to the reader by having Bloodraven tutor Bran and develop the boy's green seeing potential. As he tells Bran in A Dance with Dragons, green seeing is a rare ability and a matter of blood, and the clues point to the intermingling of Children of the Forest and crannogmen in times of old, providing the green magic abilities that we see in the Stark children. But while George has confirmed that all 6 siblings are wargs, Bran seems to be the only one marked for green seeing.
First, Bran needs to learn, though. Bloodraven will be there to guide him, and if we look at Bran's story as a sort of mini-hero's journey, this dream indicates we're at the beginning of the mentor phase of his story. While Arya learns how to be an assassin and Sansa learns how to become a political player, Bran will eventually set forth on an adventure to the far north to become the next Greenseer and wield amazing powers. When we look at these 3 characters in this light, we can see that while their stories seem very disparate, there are actually a lot of similarities between the siblings. Their arcs are all built around the journey from student to master of their respective skills.
And as Bran's mentor, Bloodraven's first lesson is to teach the boy to fly in this coma dream. When Bran points out that he doesn't have any wings, the crow replies, "There are different types of wings." So that's the crow's central role in this chapter, but not his only one. As a green experience, Bran will be shown glimpses of the world from above. Given the crow is likely in charge of this dream, he's showing the boy the potential of green magic. And like any good guide, he's there to take care of the explorer.
Yeah, the first character Bran thinks about is Jaime Lannister. It says, "A face swam up at him out of the grey mist, shining with light, golden. 'The things I do for love,' it said." Bran screamed. The crow took to the air cawing. "Not that," it shrieked at him. "Forget that. You do not need it now. Put it aside. Put it away." It landed on Bran's shoulder and pecked at him, and the shining golden face was gone.
So Bran can't quite remember who the golden face was, and the crow advises him not to think about it. By the end of A Dance with Dragons, the boy still hasn't remembered exactly what happened to him in the tower, but with Bloodraven telling him that one day he'll be able to green see even beyond the Weirwoods, the reader wonders how long it will be before Bran witnesses his fall using the green arts, notably perhaps via the crows that were specifically noted to be present. It's a plot thread that George is asking Bran and the reader to put aside for now, but it's certainly one that shouldn't be forgotten.
Next, from the skies, Bran sees his home. Observing Winterfell as the eagles see it must have been quite amazing for Bran, who then glimpses a slice of local life. Maester Luwin observing the sky through a telescope, Robb practicing swords, Hodor carrying an anvil, and the great weirwood staring at him knowingly. All great adventures begin at home, and here the crow is reminding Bran of Winterfell life.
Then Bran looks east. He sees his mother Catelyn in a galley with Sir Roger Cassel. They're heading for King's Landing, and this vision was likely occurring in real time. The mention of a storm brewing ahead of Cat that she couldn't see works as an ominous metaphor.
To the south, Bran sees his father Ned arguing with King Robert. This is obviously a glimpse of the incident near the Trident that resulted in Lady's execution. Sansa is crying and Arya is keeping secrets, which conveys a lot about the pair's stories in a few words. Before we get further details on the sisters, George switches the focus to the shadows around them. It says, "One shadow was dark as ash, with a terrible face of a hound. Another was armoured like the sun, golden and beautiful. Over them both loomed a giant in armour made of stone, but when he opened his visor, there was nothing inside but darkness and thick black blood."
Here, George is giving hints towards the future of the story, a device he loves to use in dreams and visions to provide foreshadowing and to allow the reader to engage in his puzzles. Though the golden and beautiful figure might sound like Jaime Lannister to the first-time reader, the rereader knows of a Dornish prince called Oberyn Martell who also fits the description reasonably well, given the son of the Martell sigil and the description of his armor, which notably features that sigil on his shield detailed in, quote, red gold, yellow gold, white gold, and copper. The shadow with the face of the hound is obviously Sandor Clegane, whose own arc runs very closely to those of Bran's sisters, whom this trio is described as shadowing. And the stone giant with black blood sounds like a good match for Sandor's nasty brother, Gregor Clegane, in his Feast for Crows, Sir Robert Strong form. And Gregor looming over both Sandor and Oberyn is a good symbolic fit for the trio stories, though of course, as always, we have to remind ourselves that with 2 books left in the series, new details could always arise in future that lead us to different conclusions.
Then Bran looks to the far east. He sees the Dothraki Sea, then Asshai, 2 important places for the story. Aside from the character work going on in this chapter, George is also giving us a wide view of his world building and highlighting places on the map he wants us to be familiar with. While the author has confirmed we won't be visiting the dark city of Asshai, save for possible memories, likely in a Melisandre chapter, it's a far-flung place that has an outsized effect on the story. Check out our recent episode Terra Incognita for a close look at Asshai.
And interestingly here, Bran sees dragons stirring beneath the sunrise in Asshai. Many readers wonder if that means there could be real dragons existing in the city at this moment in time. But when Dany hatches her 3 dragons at the end of this book, it's made pretty plain in an omniscient voice that dragons have returned from extinction. And the fact that the dragon birth seems to affect the levels of magic in the story supports this notion.
So that leaves us with 2 possibilities. First, and most obviously, is that Bran could be glimpsing the past, and Asshai is indeed heavily linked to dragons in bygone eras, and indeed, Dany's dragon's eggs are stated, probably falsely, to have come from ancient Asshai. Next, there's the possibility that those dragons Bran glimpses are figurative. We know George likes to represent characters in dreams by their sigils, and using dragons for Targaryens is pretty standard. So, tinfoil hats on for a moment, could there be secret Targaryens in Asshai? Do Quaithe or Melisandre have a drop of dragon's blood? Most likely George is just conveying that Asshai is pertinent to the origin of dragons, but we do love a good secret Targ conspiracy.
And from the far east, which may not be personally relevant to Bran, he then looks to the far north, which will hold a lot of relevance for him. He sees the wall, then his brother Jon Snow, quote, sleeping alone in a cold bed, his skin growing pale and hard as the memory of all warmth fled from him. And this could be a hint to Jon's murder at the end of A Dance with Dragons, where his final thoughts focused on the extreme cold he felt as he lay bleeding out in the snow.
From there, things get quite surreal. Bran looks to the far, far north, to the curtain of light at the end of the world. Then past that point into the heart of winter. It says, he looked deep into the heart of winter, and then he cried out, afraid, and the heat of his tears burned on his cheeks. Readers wonder if the heart of winter could refer to the home of the others in the lands of always winter. And the crow obviously thinks this mysterious heart of winter is highly important, as he tells Bran that is why he must wake up and live, because winter is coming.
Given that we'll hear Old Nan's tale of the last long night in Bran's next chapter, George is very much linking Bran's story to the impending invasion by the others. Even from this brief coma dream, we sense its great importance for Bran's character. While there will be many chapters on the political intrigue and internecine struggles that will weaken Westeros, the opening prologue has set the scene for something even more terrifying. An apocalyptic battle where the remnants of a war-torn continent must band together against ice demons and their undead army. Whatever goes down in the final installment of this saga, expect Bran to be a central part of it.
Finally, Bran sees a frozen wasteland below him, with ice spires flying up at him like spears. The mention, the bones of 1,000 other dreamers, impaled on those points, might hint to this being a representation of Bloodraven's cave north of the wall. In A Dance with Dragons, Bran will reach this cave where the children of the forest have lived as a greenseer community for millennia, and which is stated to contain the bones of thousands dead. One thing's for sure, George is trying to convey the great danger Bran must face to realize his destiny as a greenseer.
And of course, that makes him afraid. It says, "Can a man still be brave if he's afraid?" he heard his own voice saying, small and far away. And his father's voice replied to him, "That is the only time a man can be brave." "Now, Bran," the crow urged, "choose, fly or die." Death reached for him, screaming. Bran spread his arms and flew.
Notably, Bran draws on the strength of his father's words in this crucial moment. However, it does mark the point where Ned's role as Bran's primary instructor comes to an end, with Bloodraven taking up the reins. When Bran wakes up, both his internal and external worlds will be very different. He's going to have to learn to adapt quickly and surround himself with good friends if he's going to survive.
In the dream, Bran loves flying, and keep in mind that if he nurtures his talents, he'll be able to skin change birds and see the world from great heights once more. Who knows, perhaps he'll be able to control a dragon in the climax of the saga and oppose the others that way. With Sansa organizing Winterfell, Arya ready to stick another with the pointy end, and Bran wielding green magics, the three siblings who set out from home and learned unique skills might one day all come together to become a force to be reckoned with.
But that might be getting ahead of ourselves. First, Bran must develop his talents, and the crow is ready to teach. Bran notices the crow has a third eye, which is a metaphor for magical wisdom, and at the end of the coma dream, the crow pecks Bran's forehead between the eyes. Bran must open his own third eye if he is to succeed, so now he has an internal character goal. His external goal, as we'll be covering in this series, will be to reach Bloodraven's cave north of the wall and begin his green-seeing lessons in earnest.
At the end of the dream, the crow turns into a serving woman at Winterfell who flees to tell everyone that Bran has awoken, opening his actual eyes for the first time in months. He can't feel his legs, but has been assured that one day he'll be able to fly. When Robb bursts into the room, Bran's direwolf has joined him on his bed. The wolf, Bran declares, is called Summer, a fitting name for the bond companion of a sweet summer child whose destiny just might be to defeat winter. But first, Bran is going to have to learn to live in a world that has changed and will continue to change around him as his family comes to grips with the political maelstrom that is descending upon Westeros. And now, at the midpoint of the episode, it's time for us to say thanks to our patrons from the Valyrian Steel level. Thanks so much to Aileen, Oxheart, Blithe Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Cabbath the Unfrozen, Dean, Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Dolorous Fred, Jill, JM, Herbert Westeros, the Miskatonic Maester, Lady Silverwing, Mark, Boss, Schwartz the Black, the Sithorian, Sally, Tristis Lorien, Wild Child of the Wolfswood, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castleknocky, the Alpha Patron.
It was just a lie.
He said bitterly, remembering the crow from his dream.
I can't fly. I can't even run.
Crows are all liars. Old Nan agreed from the chair where she sat doing her needlework. I know a story about a crow.
I don't want any more stories.
Bran snapped, his voice petulant. He'd liked Old Nan and her stories once, before, but it was different now. They left her with him all day now to watch over him and clean him and keep him from being lonely, but she just made it worse.
I hate your stupid stories. Bran has awoken from his post-traumatic coma to find the world has changed around him. His 8th birthday had come and gone. His parents had both left, as did his sisters and Jon, and many of the prominent members of the household as well. In one passage it says, "To Bran it felt as if they had all died while he had slept, or perhaps Bran had died and they had forgotten him." He is feeling sad, bitter, lonely and sorry for himself as he watches his little brother Rickon running with the wolves in the castle yard.
And while Rickon amused himself with childish play in which Bran could never again join, Robb was absorbed with being Robb the Lord and seemed to have no time for Bran. This is a callback to Bran observing his father's 2 faces, the public-facing one and the private one he kept for his family. Only Robb doesn't seem to have time to don the private face and be Bran and Rickon's brother, since he's preoccupied with planning for war, though Bran doesn't seem to understand either the reality of what Robb is doing or the reasons why he's doing it.
Old Nan has been mentioned a number of times so far in Bran's and other chapters, mostly in the context of the stories she told the children. In this chapter, we get a front row seat to her storytelling. When Bran, remembering the crow from his dreams, bemoans, "It was just a lie, I can't fly, I can't even run," she agrees that all crows are liars and offers to tell Bran a story about a crow. Bran, though, is tired of his bed, tired of Old Nan, tired of stories, tired of everything that's no longer the way it was before he fell, and so he lashes out at her. "I don't want any more stories," he says, adding spitefully, "I hate your stupid stories."
Undeterred, Old Nan smiles gently and denies possession of the stories she tells. "Not mine. The stories are. Before me and after me, before you too. They're definitely not a thing anyone can own or take credit for." And along with her philosophy of storytelling, we get our first full description of Nan, as well as her backstory. She is, Bran thinks, a very ugly old woman, shrunken and wrinkled, almost blind, too weak to climb stairs, with only a few wisps of white hair left to cover a mottled pink scalp. Her backstory is that she's been at Winterfell for generations, having arrived either when Bran's grandfather, or perhaps his great-grandfather, was a child, as wet nurse to a baby named Brandon Stark, whose mother had died in childbirth. Bran thinks she might be the oldest person in the 7 Kingdoms.
There are a number of fan theories about Old Nan's origins, but perhaps the best known one is that she was, in her youth, one of the free folk. This chapter contains much of the evidence that, with her declaration to Bran that crows are all liars, sounding very much like something the free folk with whom Jon Snow will become acquainted would say about the human crows from the Night's Watch. In fact, it's entirely possible that the rejected story about a crow might have actually been a story about a black brother. Then moments later, as we'll see, she offers a story about the White Walkers. While Bran is quick to correct her with the common usage, "You mean the others," which she agrees with amiably, many readers have pointed out that the only other people who call the others White Walkers are the free folk, which is completely in line with her possible usage of the term crows.
In Bran's very next chapter, we'll be introduced to a member of the Free Folk who finds herself south of the Wall and falls into the service of House Stark, because Asha, as she's called, will eventually become a caregiver for Bran's little brother Rickon. It could be suggested that her arc is a parallel of sorts to some things we can speculate about Nan. And that speculation continues when it's stated that Nan remained at Winterfell after the child she came to care for died of a summer chill. She had 2 sons of her own who died in Robert's Rebellion, and a grandson who perished at the Siege of Pike during Balon Greyjoy's rebellion, the very event which saw Theon Greyjoy become a ward to Lord Eddard Stark.
With her daughters all moved away and dead, we're told that Nan's only blood relative remaining at Winterfell is her great-grandson Hodor, the simple-minded giant of a stable boy who is becoming Bran's own beast of burden, a porter of sorts who can be called upon to bring the boy from his chamber to wherever he might need to go within the great castle, an invaluable asset in a place that's full of stairs and narrow passages.
And Hodor's enormous size is what leads fans to this final bit of speculation about old Nan's past. In A Dance with Dragons, Bran will have a vision of, quote, a brown-haired girl, slender as a spear, who stood on the tips of her toes to kiss the lips of a young knight as tall as Hodor. Since there is one particularly giant knight from Westeros' past that's known to us, that is, Sir Duncan the Tall, whom we know is destined to pass through Winterfell one day, fans love to wonder if the brown-haired girl is Nan and the tall knight is Sir Duncan, and if, through Nan, Dunk is the great-grandfather of the 7-foot-tall stable boy, Hodor.
Only time can tell us the answer to these questions about old Nan's past, of course, but it's worth noting that all of the hints so far are from Bran chapters, and so we can hope that it will be in a future Bran chapter where we one day find those answers. For now, we return to Bran in his bedchamber and the somewhat unwelcome insistence by old Nan that he listen to one of her many stories.
After offering a story about a crow that Bran has no interest in, she owlishly offers one about a boy who hated stories, followed by an offer of one about Brandon the Builder. Always one of his favorites, she says, but Bran thinks that she's confusing him with some Brandon from the past. His favorites, he insists, have always been the scary ones. And here's where we get that front row seat to one of the most important stories within the story, The Legend of the Long Night, which offers the reader an exposition of sorts on the White Walkers, also known as the Others, who appeared in the prologue and then remain mostly off-page for the rest of the series, but for a number of references and stories of increasing unease and darkness, of which this is the first and most thorough.
Old Nan's story, which we've covered in depth in a number of other episodes, relates the story of the first time the Others appeared in Westeros, thousands of years ago, when the only men in Westeros were the First Men, and the children of the forest still lived in their forest cities and hollow hills. Nan tells of an endless winter and a night that lasted a generation, and the atrocities visited upon humans by the Others, who were, quote, cold things, dead things that hated iron and fire and the touch of the sun, and every creature with hot blood in its veins.
Her story continues by detailing the rise of the so-called last hero of the First Men, who was, quote, determined to seek out the children of the forest in the hopes that their ancient magics could win back what the armies of men had lost. This hero set out with a dozen companions, as well as his own horse, dog, and sword. Over the course of years, one by one, he lost everything, including his sword, and then, when he was completely alone and defenseless, she tells how the others came for him. They smelled the hot blood in him and came silent on his trail, stalking him with packs of pale white spiders, big as hounds.
But before we can learn about the fate of the last hero, Nan's story is interrupted by the arrival of Maester Luwin and Hodor, bearing news that there are visitors at Winterfell and that Bran's presence is required. This is a classic device that George uses often, interrupting a story or info drop before something particularly juicy can be shared with the reader. He wants us curious, but not spoiled. Bran notes that Luwin isn't smiling, though Hodor is, as is his usual. After a brief protest about the story being interrupted, Bran asks who the visitors are, and is told that it's Tyrion Lannister, accompanied by some men of the Night's Watch, and that they bring word from Jon.
Bran is carried into the Great Hall where Robb was receiving the visitors, and it says that Bran could, quote, sense the anger in the hall the moment that Hodor carried him through the doors. Remember that while Bran was unconscious, a man had tried to kill him using a Valyrian steel dagger, following which Catelyn had revealed her sister's suspicions about the Lannisters killing Jon Arryn to Robb, Theon, Luwin, and Sir Roderick Cassel. Catelyn herself made the connection with Jaime Lannister, not taking part in the hunt on the day of Bran's fall, to arrive at the correct conclusion about the fall, although her assumptions about his motivations and the larger picture remained somewhat faulty. Nevertheless, at this point in the story, with Catelyn on her way to King's Landing to bring Ned news about the Cat's Paw, Robb has been left in charge and is now convinced that the Lannisters are behind 2 attempts on Bran's life. Since he doesn't have all the specifics, he assumes all Lannisters are equally guilty, whether he has proof that they were part of the plot or not. And so, Tyrion's reception is more than a little frosty.
So frosty, in fact, that Robb was sitting in the high seat of the Starks with a naked sword across his knees. He was in the process of pointedly offering the hospitality of Winterfell to the men of the Watch when Bran and Hodor entered the hall. Tyrion, who's no fool, certainly got the message about his own welcome, but to his credit, he remained calm and focused on his business with Bran. After a tense moment in which Tyrion calls Robb boy and gets the sword pointed at his face, Bran's arrival seems to diffuse the situation somewhat.
Bran is mainly used as an observer to this scene playing out between the representatives of 2 houses that, unbeknownst to either Bran or Tyrion, are on the brink of armed conflict. A lot has happened while Bran slept and since Tyrion took his leave. The day will soon come when Bran is left to be the Stark in Winterfell and sit in that chair for more than just show. For now, he's been brought out mainly to show a Lannister that he lives. But then, something unexpected happens.
It turns out that Tyrion has a gift of sorts for Bran. Asking Bran if he likes to ride, he offers up a design for an adaptive saddle that can be used with a specially trained horse so that Bran can once again ride, telling him, "I swear to you, boy, on horseback, you will be as tall as any of them." Robb is clearly puzzled by this act of kindness and asks why Tyrion would want to help his brother. It's worth noting that at this point Tyrion has his own suspicions about Bran's accident and that his get a little bit closer to the actual reasons behind it than the Starks do. But his reply to Robb is quite matter of fact, combined with a bit of Tyrion's trademark cynicism. "Your brother Jon asked it of me, and I have a tender spot in my heart for cripples and bastards and broken things."
Jon Snow had made a friend or ally of sorts of Tyrion, highlighting his own abilities as a leader. As he'll soon learn, factionalism is as dangerous on the wall as it is within a kingdom. Rob, who has taken the more reductionist view of us versus them, is left flat footed by Tyrion's unexpected gesture and will soon be awkwardly trying to make amends. But first, Tyrion's frosty reception isn't quite over. Rickon arrives in basically the same form in which Bran had been observing him at the beginning of the chapter, a maelstrom of energy accompanied by 3 direwolves. He bursts into the hall, and it quickly becomes obvious that the wolves, as Theon Greyjoy says, don't like Tyrion's smell.
Tyrion is menaced by all 3 wolves, and the reader is left with questions. Does Summer remember the scent or even the image of Jaime from the day of Bran's fall? Does their connection with Nymeria give them knowledge of other Lannister aggressions? Do they know that Cersei Lannister is responsible for their dead sister? Do the connections the wolves share with their humans and each other in fact leave them with the same suspicions about all Lannisters that Robb and his companions share? Or does Theon Greyjoy have the right of it and they simply don't like Tyrion Lannister's scent?
After a few tense moments, the wolves are called off, and even Robb is described as looking shaken. When Tyrion declares he will leave, Robb tries awkwardly to walk back his lack of courtesy, but Tyrion refuses him, saying, "Spare me your false courtesies, boy. You do not love me, and you do not want me here." Once again, the boy is quite pointed. Robb had already corrected him on it, but then continued to act very much the boy. This is a learning moment for him that harks back to that moment in Catelyn's chamber when he learned about the apparent Lannister plot against his family and brandished his naked blade, earning him a hearty reproof from Sir Roderick.
When Tyrion departs, Robb sends the Night's Watchman to find their quarters and declares he will host them for dinner that evening. Bran is returned to his own chamber, where he falls asleep and dreams. In the dream he is climbing, but the omnipresent gargoyles of the First Keep don't seem quite as friendly as they used to. It says, "The gargoyles watched him ascend. Their eyes glowed red as hot coals in a brazier. Perhaps once they had been lions, but now they were twisted and grotesque." Bran could hear them whispering to each other in soft stone voices, terrible to hear. He must not listen, he told himself. He must not hear. So long as he did not hear them, he was safe. But when the gargoyles pulled themselves loose from the stone and padded down the side of the tower to where Bran clung, he knew he was not safe after all. "I didn't hear," he wept as they came closer and closer. I didn't.
Bran's repressed memories have clearly been triggered by Tyrion's presence. It's unclear if Robb would have told him of what they suspected regarding his fall or the reasons for their mother's departure, but based on Bran's confusion over Tyrion's reception, it seems unlikely. When he awoke, it was to find Hodor in his room, ready to take him down to the hall for dinner with the Night's Watchman.
Their news of Jon is limited to an in-joke. Sir Alice's bane. Tyrion could actually have told them more had he been welcomed, but they do offer hard news about Uncle Benjen when Robb asks. Upon hearing that their uncle is missing and presumed dead, Robb stands up with hand on sword hilt. He's had enough of bad news and says loudly, "My uncle is not dead." When one of the younger men allows that if anyone could survive the haunted forest, it would be Bran Stark, Euron replies, "Maybe. Good men have gone into those woods before and never come out." And the reader can't help but wonder if he's thinking of Garred, who, as an experienced ranger that had been 40 years on the wall, had gone into the forest with Sir Waymar and never returned.
Bran's thoughts returned to the story about the last hero that old Nan had been telling him earlier, and it becomes obvious that it was a story he'd heard many times before because he knows the ending. It says he blurted, "The children will help him, the children of the forest," and that Maester Luwin quickly moved to correct him, as maesters will, saying, "Bran, the children of the forest have been dead and gone for thousands of years. All that is left of them are the faces in the trees."
Euron of the Night's Watch didn't seem so shocked by Bran's suggestion and made the cryptic statement, Down here, might be that's true, maester, but up past the wall, who's to say? Up there, a man can't always tell what's alive and what's dead. So Euron implies that he has some secret knowledge of what goes on beyond the wall. Combined with the fact that he already asserted that he thinks Benjen is dead, this leans much further into the can't always tell what's alive and what's dead territory of knowledge of the other's undead servants than of any confidence that the children of the forest might still be out there, rendering aid to humans in distress.
Of course, this is a nice little bit of prefiguring for Bran's arc, since this is more or less exactly what he will one day encounter beyond the wall, the children and the undead. But it's very interesting to consider what sorts of esoteric knowledge the men of the Watch, especially the Rangers, might be holding on to. In addition, Lewin's statement contains a nice little tidbit about the children and the faces on the weirwoods. When he says, all that is left of them are the faces in the trees, he essentially suggests that those faces were created by, or perhaps are the actual remnants of, the children of the forest.
After dinner, Robb brings Bran back to his chamber. The brothers sit together in the dark, where Robb can be Bran's brother, not Lord Stark. He makes a number of promises founded in hope. Only one of them, the promise to get Bran a horse, will ever come true, though one day Bran will go north and arrive unexpectedly at the wall. We sense that Robb is overwhelmed by what life is requiring of him. Without a POV for Robb, it's important for us to remember that his life has also changed in immeasurable ways. He's been left in charge of both of his brothers, including the baby Rickon, whose needs he can never quite meet. He's also been given the heavy responsibility of being the Stark in Winterfell, which at this point involves an awful lot of activities that appear to be the precursors to assembling an army.
The chapter ends with the brothers experiencing a moment of closeness, shedding tears and holding hands in the dark. When we next see them, much will have changed in their world, and war, tragedy, and heartbreak will be inching closer to House Stark.
A light snow was falling. Bran could feel the flakes on his face melting as they touched his skin like the gentlest of rains. He sat straight atop his horse, watching as the iron portcullis was winched upward. Try as he might to keep calm, his heart was fluttering in his chest.
A number of weeks, perhaps as much as 2 months, pass between Tyrion Lannister's visit and Bran's next chapter. During this time, a saddle was made for Bran, following Tyrion's design, and a young horse trained to ride with it. But also during those same weeks, Bran's mother had taken Tyrion captive at the Crossroads Inn and brought him to the Vale of Arryn, where he was tried for a crime he didn't commit and would only be released after his champion, the sellsword Bronn, defeated the champion of the Vale, Ser Vardis Egen, in single combat.
Robb had also received word from their mother to alert their bannermen to ready the defences of the north, something he had been preparing to do since she left for the south. Bran's 5th chapter begins with him and Robb, accompanied by Theon, Maester Luwin, and a handful of guards, preparing to ride out from Winterfell, Bran's first excursion beyond the castle walls since his fall, and a monumental step towards independence, thanks to the very man his mother had arrested in connection with the attempts on his life at Winterfell.
As they ride out, Bran's point of view indicates his momentary unease with Theon Greyjoy, who's described as smiling a lot, as if the world were a secret joke that only he was clever enough to understand. It goes on to indicate that while Robb seemed to look up to Theon and enjoy his company, the young Iron Man made Bran uncomfortable, and that, like his brother Jon, he had, quote, never warmed to his father's ward.
Riding on, Bran mentions to Robb that his direwolf Summer had been howling the previous night. Robb tells him that Grey Wind, his wolf, was also restless, and adds that there had been a raven from King's Landing the night before. Robb, clearly wondering if the two things are connected, says, "Sometimes I think they know things, sense things." and the reader should take note of the mounting evidence that the Stark direwolves have extremely unique connections with their human counterparts, as well as with each other.
Bran reacts to the news about the Raven with a sense of dread. He recalls the message from their mother at the Eyrie, the news about Tyrion, whom he had sort of liked in spite of the odd feeling his family name gave him, and the flurry of activity that had followed, messages going out to all of House Stark's bannermen, and talk of fortifying Moat Cailin at the Neck, the only land approach to the north from the south. There had also been a message from Castle Black confirming that their uncle Benjen was still missing. And now this, a message that appeared to have somehow upset not only Robb, but the direwolves.
While Robb seems reluctant to tell Bran everything given his age, 8-year-old Bran points out that he's the heir after Robb and that he needs to be informed. Robb is described as sounding sad and even a little scared when he agrees, and the news from the south gives a strong hint as to why. Robb describes the attack on their father and his men by Jaime Lannister in the streets of King's Landing, with 3 Winterfell men ending up dead, including Jory Cassell, the captain of their household guard and a constant presence in all of their lives, and their father injured by his falling horse, now lying sedated by milk of the poppy, with only uncertainty offered as to when he'd awake.
Robb seems to be wrestling with the possibility that Ned might not survive his injuries, and what he must do if that comes to pass. Theon rides up and urges blood for blood, stating that Robb should call the banners and speaking their fears out loud. If your father dies, Robb will be Lord of Winterfell. Although Robb hastens to reassure Bran, it's clear now why the mention of their status as heirs has made his brother sad.
The message from King's Landing had been utterly lacking in context, so Robb and Bran are left not knowing why their father was attacked or how Jory and the others ended up dead. News that the Hand of the King and his household guard had been attacked by the Queen's brother, a member of the King's Guard, in the streets of the capital is so outrageous that it absolutely requires context. Without it, the Starks at Winterfell are essentially stumbling blindly through a dark forest with unknown enemies on all sides. A metaphor, incidentally, that is entirely in keeping with the story George is telling from the very first page.
And speaking of forests, the riding excursion soon takes the group into the Wolf's Wood. As they near a river, Bran is momentarily lost in memories of Jory and Jon. Crossing the river, Bran begins to feel stronger, happier, just from being outdoors and free under the trees. When the sound of the wolves howling reaches their ears, Robb realizes they must have made a kill and heads off to locate them, assuring Bran that Theon and the rest would catch up with them shortly.
But when he heard the noise of people approaching, it wasn't the Winterfell folk he was waiting for, but 6 strangers. Immediately conscious of the richness of his dress and horse, Bran knew these were not innocent farmers or foresters. The biggest man began querying Bran about who he was, and that was when he noticed that he and one of his companions were dressed in rags that might have once been black. Instantly, he remembered his father's words to him about deserters on that day at the Holdfast when Garrett had been sentenced to death. No man is more dangerous. The deserter knows his life is forfeit if he is taken, so he will not flinch from any crime, no matter how vile or cruel.
When the man begins to make demands, that Bran turn over his silver cloak pin and that he dismount and turn over his horse, Bran realizes that of the 6, 2 are women. He also realizes that he's in very big trouble if Robb and the others don't show up. Bran nervously says that he can't get off the horse, and one woman, whose name turns out to be Asha, suggests that he might in fact be a cripple and telling the truth. She was suggesting that Bran, if indeed a Stark, would be a valuable hostage for Mance, and that is the king beyond the wall, who's been mentioned a number of times previously, when the leader replied, "Mance be damned, you want to go back there, Asha? More fool you. Think the White Walkers will care if you have a hostage?"
And so we get a very clear picture of why these deserters from the Watch had fled south of the Wall along with 4 wildlings. They clearly have either first-hand knowledge or something very close of the return of the others to the lands beyond the wall. In fact, his use of the term White Walkers implies that the knowledge comes directly from the Free Folk, as the wildlings call themselves, since it is they who use that term, while others is used in Westeros, which presumably includes the Men of the Watch.
The leader, whose name was Stiv, decided to test Asha's hypothesis. Spotting the straps around Bran's legs, Stiv slashed at one of them with his knife, cutting through not just leather and the woolen trousers beneath, but deep into Bran's flesh. His momentary surprise at Bran's lack of reaction to being cut so deeply was interrupted by a voice. "Put down your steel now, and I promise you shall have a quick and painless death." Robb had returned with the wolf's kill slung across his horse's hindquarters.
Asha seemed to be the only one of the group who wasn't eager to kill the heirs of Winterfell. She made another effort to de-escalate the situation by suggesting that if Robb turned over the horses and the elk, the group would let them go in peace. In answer, Robb whistled and Grey Wind and Summer appeared from the forest behind him. Only the second woman, Hallie of the Free Folk, seemed truly alarmed by the direwolves. Stiv was downright dismissive, calling the wolves dogs and ordering his companions to take them.
In a matter of moments, Robb was charging and had taken out one of the men who was wielding an axe, while Grey Wind brought down the second deserter. Robb was battling Asha in the stream and had just ridden over her when she overbalanced and fell, while Grey Wind raced to take out the fourth man as Summer went for Hallie. There is a fascinating description of his attack from Bran's perspective. It says, "Summer darted in and snapped at Hallie. The knife bit at his flank. Summer slid away, snarling, and came rushing in again. This time his jaws closed around her calf. Holding the knife in both hands, the small woman stabbed down, but the direwolf seemed to sense the blade coming. He pulled free for an instant, his mouth full of leather and cloth and bloody flesh. When Hallie stumbled and fell, he came at her again, slamming her backward, teeth tearing at her belly."
It's easy enough, when reading the very fast-paced action scene, to not notice something strange about Summer's attack. Let's roll it back and review. This time his jaws closed around her calf. Holding the knife with both hands, the small woman stabbed down, but the direwolf seemed to sense the blade coming. On a reread, it should be obvious that Summer sensed the blade because Bran saw the blade. And in fact, what happens next serves to further emphasize that connection and to suggest that it goes both ways.
With all of his companions down, Stiv realized the time had come for desperate action. Remember Ned's warning to Bran that a deserter, quote, will not flinch from any crime? Stiv saw that he had one last chance of escape, though in truth, he ought to have remembered that Bran had also mentioned guards. Nevertheless, seizing his opportunity to bargain his way out of a losing situation, Stiv, who had remained at Bran's side during the attack so far, cut his remaining straps and pulled Bran from his horse, placing his dagger at Bran's throat and calling a warning to Robb. "Back away, or I'll open the boy's windpipe. I swear it."
As Robb stopped moving, it says, "In that moment Bran saw everything. His wolf Summer continued to savage the woman Hallie, and it says Bran could see her eyes, an unlikely viewpoint from where Bran was being held on the opposite stream bank. He saw the two dead men in the stream, and Asha trying to reach her spear as Grey Wind turned from the fourth man and went to stop her. But Stiv saw too and demanded that Robb call off the wolves, or the crippled boy dies now. Robb complied, calling the wolves, and Grey Wind returned to his side. Summer, though, stayed put. It says, his eyes were on Bran and the man beside him. He growled. His muzzle was wet and red, but his eyes burned.
Stiv recognized that the wolves were the biggest threat and attempted to order Asha to kill them. When she declined, he turned to Robb and demanded that he get off his horse and kill the wolves himself. Bran knew with certainty that they would be dead either way and screamed no to his brother, providing a momentary distraction in which Stiv's attention was focused on his hostage. In that moment, Bran heard a thrum from the woods at their backs, and the next moment, Stiv was gasping and stumbling, his dagger falling away from Bran's throat as he collapsed into the stream with 6 inches of arrow protruding from his chest.
Stiv, as we said, had forgotten about the guards. Osha saw them emerging from the trees and threw down her spear, asking for mercy. Maester Luwin followed and, as all the men took in the scene of carnage in shocked silence, hurried to Bran's side. It was then that Bran turned around and saw Theon Greyjoy standing on a rise behind him, with his hunting bow in hand. It was he who had taken out Stiv with a single arrow, though Robb's reaction to what he saw as his own heroism was definitely not what he expected.
When Theon declared that a dead enemy is a thing of beauty, Robb responded angrily, "Jon always said you were an ass, Greyjoy. I ought to chain you up in the yard and let Bran take a few practice shots at you." While Theon thinks Robb should be thanking him, Robb sees it very differently. What if you had missed the shot? What if you had only wounded him? What if you had made his hand jump or hit Bran instead? For all you knew, the man might have been wearing a breastplate. All you could see was the back of his cloak. What would have happened to my brother then? Did you ever think of that, Greyjoy?
While Robb's anger at the guards, and in particular Theon, is made clear, Bran's own opinion isn't even hinted at. In this particular scene, he exists simply to witness a scene in which the cracks in the relationship between Robb and Theon begin. Easy enough for them to be close as brothers when they are social equals, both heirs to a High Lord, and better yet, Theon's age and experience giving him a slight edge on Robb. But as Robb grows into manhood and the responsibilities life bestows upon him, their relationship will change, and this scene lays the foundations for that.
With Bran's injury described as nothing more than a scratch by Maester Luwin, Robb turns his attention to the dead and to Osha. Wondering what could have made the group so foolish as to come close enough to Winterfell to be discovered, he instructs the men to take the heads of the deserters to be sent to the wall and to leave the rest. Osha begs for her life, reminding Robb that she herself is not an oath-breaker. Ever bloodthirsty, Theon suggests they give her to the wolves.
It was Bran who confirmed that she was a wildling and had mentioned Mance Rayder, at which Luwin suggests that it might be good to question her. Clearly relieved that the killing was done for the day, Robb agrees, instructing the guards to bind her. She'll come back to Winterfell with us and live or die by the truths she gives us.
Little do Bran and Robb realize as they return to Winterfell, but their lives and destinies have already changed beyond recognition. Within days, their mother will take her leave of the Eyrie, making her way north to a hoped-for reunion with her sons, while Tyrion Lannister would be released and begin to make his way west to a different reunion with his own father. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Jaime Lannister had fled for the west and their father had awakened after his injuries. Holding court in Robert's name, Ned would send a small fighting force to bring the king's justice to Sir Gregor Clegane, Tywin Lannister's bannerman, accused of atrocities in the Riverlands, and then, in turn, warned the isolated queen that he had discovered her secret relationship with her twin.
When Robert returned from a hunting trip mortally wounded, everything would change. And it is in that changed world that Bran's next chapter takes place.
The Karstarks came in on a cold, windy morning, bringing 300 horsemen and near 2,000 foot from their castle at Carhold. The steel points of their pikes winked in the pale sunlight as the column approached. A man went before them, pounding out a slow, deep-throated marching rhythm on a drum that was bigger than he was. Boom, boom, boom.
Nearly 4 months before the beginning of Bran VI, in King's Landing, Ned had given Catelyn specific instructions for his bannermen. to fortify Moat Cailin, the impenetrable barrier that serves as the southern border of the north, to instruct Wyman Manderley to strengthen the defences of White Harbour, the north's primary port, and to set a careful watch over Theon Greyjoy in case his father's fleet was needed. When it came to war with the West, Ned would no doubt have remembered the lessons of the past and the use to which Rhaenyra Targaryen had put young Lord Dalton Greyjoy during her own war when she found herself in opposition to House Lannister.
As we know, Catelyn didn't personally deliver Ned's message to Robb or to the Bannermen, but she did send the orders north from the Eyrie. Robb had spent weeks riding out to visit the closer holdfasts and sending messages back and forth with the other Bannermen. And then news of Ned's ambush in the streets of King's Landing and Jory's death had arrived. But within days of that news, far away in the capital, Robert had died, Ned was betrayed, and Sansa taken as hostage by the Queen, who then had her send messages to her family at Winterfell, Riverrun, and the Eyrie, stating that Ned had conspired with Robert's brothers to usurp the throne from Joffrey.
Now, as far as Robb and Bran knew, Ned was in some southern dungeon, his life depending on his family coming to King's Landing to bend the knee to Joffrey. But whether due to a sense of northern honour or a conviction that Cersei's words delivered by Sansa were neither honest nor a guarantee of anything at all, Robb had summoned his father's banners and was making preparations to march south.
As Bran watched the Karstarks arrive, the last of the banners who would assemble at Winterfell, Maester Luwin numbered the northern army at 12,000 men, or near enough as makes no matter. Incidentally, given the Karstarks brought around 2,300 men, that makes them a significant percentage of Robb's army, a detail which will become very important later on, although is outside of our scope here.
Much of this chapter deals with the rapid changes that had been taking place at Winterfell since the day in the Wolfswood. We've outlined much of the rapid-fire sequence of events in the south, while in this chapter, Bran relays what played out in the north following the messages about Ned's ambush and Catelyn's arrest of Tyrion Lannister that were referenced in the Wolfswood chapter. Before the Karstarks had come Mormonts, Glovers, Boltons, Hornwoods, Kerwins, Tallhearts, and Umbers. Robb had seemingly transformed permanently into Robb the Lord, and Rickon into a wild child whose grief at the near constant loss of family members had led to an unfettered rage that had the coincident effect of making his direwolf Shaggy Dog just as wild and angry. After an incident in the crypts where it had, quote, taken Robb himself and Grey Wind to bring him to bay, we're told the Black Wolf had been chained in the kennels, with Rickon angry and inconsolable and not yet 4 years old to boot, and Robb too busy with his preparations to spend any meaningful time being Bran's brother. Bran was increasingly left to his own devices, with Hodor as his main companion.
We get a sense of what's happening in the south when Bran asks Luwin when Robb will march. Luwin's response is revelatory of a number of things. He must march soon, or not at all. The winter town is full to bursting, and this army of his will eat the countryside clean if it camps here much longer. Others are waiting to join him all along the King's Road, Barrow Knights and Crannogmen and the Lords Manderley and Flint. The fighting has begun in the Riverlands, and your brother has many leagues to go.
So, we know that Houses Manderley, Flint of Widow's Watch, Dustin and Riswell will be joining their men with Robb's as they march south, and that there will be a levy from House Reed's Crannogmen as well. Critically, Luwin tells Bran that the fighting has begun in the Riverlands. Since we know that Ned sent Beric Dondarrion with 100 men to bring the King's justice to Sir Gregor Clegane following Gregor's attacks on the small folk of the Riverlands, we can assume that news of Gregor's rampaging and the subsequent battle between Lord Beric's force and the Lannisters at the Mummers Ford had made it back to Winterfell.
Talk of fighting and Robb leaving made Bran miserable, and he decided he wanted to visit the Godswood. While in this chapter it says that Bran had always liked the Godswood, we should recall that just before his fall he had started out in the Godswood with Summer. While it was clear that it was a common place for him to play, he wasn't entirely comfortable with the Heart Tree, as it says that on that occasion he took, quote, the long way around to avoid the pool where the Heart Tree grew. The Heart Tree had always frightened him. Trees ought not have eyes, or leaves that looked like hands.
Now, though, it says that he feels drawn to the Godswood, and that, quote, even the Heart Tree no longer scared him the way it used to. Bran is still aware of the eyes of the tree watching him, but he's also come to understand that those eyes are part of the old gods, the gods of the Starks and the First Men and the children of the forest, his father's gods. Being in the presence of his family's gods not only makes him feel safe, but provides him with the quiet, an island of peace, it says, that he needs to think. And apparently thinking is something Bran is doing quite a bit of these days, as it says, quote, thinking and dreaming and talking with the gods.
Now, thinking and introspection would be quite natural for a boy in Bran's position, but the inclusion of the terms dreaming and talking with the gods gives us pause. Whenever we discuss Bran's dream from Bran III, it's often with the understanding that it was a one-off, a dream that was sent not just to show Bran things he needed to see, but in order to wake him from his coma. Now we have to wonder, as his connection with Summer grows, is Bran also having more dreams? Has he actually entered into a dialogue of sorts with the three-eyed crow or with the old gods in the Heart Tree itself? As we and Bran will eventually come to understand, the trees are a vehicle of sorts for greenseers, and in particular, the three-eyed crow and the so-called last greenseer are one and the same. So, Bran's dreaming and talking might also be one and the same, or at least involve a dialogue with the same individual in each context.
On this occasion, Bran's purpose at the Heart Tree is simple and straightforward: prayer for his family. He asked the gods to let Robb stay, or if not, to bring him home safely, along with their parents and sisters. And he adds a particular request for his younger brother Rickon that no one knows how to soothe. Make it so Rickon understands.
But Bran knows in his heart that Robb won't stay behind. His reasoning, when told by Luwin that he could choose one of the bannermen, or even Theon Greyjoy, 5 years his elder, to lead the army, is that his father would have never stayed home while sending men off to war. Robb knows it, Luwin knows it, and Bran knows it. Robb is, first and foremost, a Stark and heir to Lord Eddard, who, even as his sons watched the banners stream into Winterfell, was a captive in the black cells of the Red Keep, many long leagues to the south.
Much of this chapter provides exposition on the Lords of the North, and of Robb growing into the role that destiny had laid before him. And so we learn about the Carstocks and the Umbers, Boltons, Glovers and Mormonts, the Hornwoods, and the Starks' nearest neighbours, the Kerwins. All wanted something from Robb and wanted to test him. From Bran's perspective, Robb the Lord acquitted himself well, replying to each request with, quote, cool courtesy, much as father might have. And it continues, somehow he bent them to his will.
But Robb had to admit that sometimes these lords scared him. He told Bran that he wished Ned was there, in a way that any child might long for a beloved parent's presence, to give guidance or reassurance. It seems that Bran treasured those moments when his older brother would confide in him, and him alone, the cares and worries he was wrestling with. As for Ned, it became obvious that what news had made its way north since his arrest was, at best, word of mouth, colored by having passed through many retellings, or at worst, blatant rumor and speculation.
In fact, Sansa's letter was the closest they had received to actual news, and it was obvious to Robb as well as Bran that something was amiss with that. When Robb spoke the words out loud, "What's wrong with the girl?" Bran could only think of one answer: she lost her wolf. the connection between the Starks and their wolves has been growing and becoming more overt in the months since Ned and the girls departed. Bran recalls how, when Lady's bones arrived at Winterfell, accompanied by 4 guardsmen, Summer and Grey Wind and Shaggy Dog had all sensed her coming and had begun howling before the party reached the drawbridge. Lady had been buried in the Winterfell lichyard, and the fact that the wolf, much like his grandfather Rickard and Uncle Brandon, had gone south, but only her bones had returned, seems like a terrible omen to Bran, not only for their father and sisters, but for his elder brother, who is now preparing to march south.
And as Bran sits beneath the heart tree praying for Robb's safety, it says, "A faint wind sighed through the godswood, and the red leaves stirred and whispered." That was when Bran became aware of Asha, the wildling woman who had been taken captive in the Wolfswood and now worked in the Winterfell kitchens. Asha asks if he hears the gods, referring to the wind, and reminds Bran that the old gods are her gods too, emphasizing for the first time in the series that wildlings are actually just first men who happen to live on the north side of the wall. When Bran protests that it's just wind, she replies, "Who do you think sends the wind, if not the gods? They see you, boy. They hear you talking. That rustling, that's them talking back."
Bran naturally wants to know what the gods are saying. The fact that he seems to not know these things might imply that his earlier thoughts about dreaming and talking with his gods are things that happen simultaneously, in his chamber while he sleeps, rather than out here in the godswood. Asha does seem to know, or at least she has a message she wants very badly to get to the young Lord of Winterfell. He's bound on marching the wrong way. It's north he should be taking his swords. North, not south.
Asha also reminds Bran that the old gods have less power in the south due to the weirwood trees there being cut down many centuries ago. And when he asks, she tells him about what's happening beyond the wall. "I tried to tell your brother when he asked his questions, him and your maester and that smiley boy Greyjoy. The cold winds are rising, and men go out from their fires and never come back. Or if they do, they're not men no more, but only wights with blue eyes and cold black hands. Why do you think I run south with Stiv and Hallie and the rest of them fools? Mance thinks he'll fight, the brave, sweet, stubborn man, like the White Walkers were no more than rangers. But what does he know? He can call himself king beyond the wall all he likes, but he's still just another old black crow who flew down from the Shadow Tower. He's never tasted winter. I was born up there, child, like my mother and her mother before her and her mother before her, born of the free folk. We remember."
So the free folk, like Northmen, remember. And as we've said in the past, it's possible that the phrase, "the North remembers," is a holdover from an ancient past, which Northmen did remember for many generations, until the remembering came to feel and sound like so many fairy tales and children's stories, the snarks and grumpkins of Tyrion Lannister's cynical southern assessment.
Bran assures Asha that Robb will listen to him, but he never has a chance to talk to his brother. Later at dinner, when Maester Luwin asks Bran if he'd ever thought about studying to become one of his order, Bran wonders if he could learn magic, recalling that the crow had promised him that he would fly. Luwin, of course, demurs, but Bran remembers the children of the forest, which makes him remember Asha's words. However, when he tries to explain her warning to Maester Luwin, he's advised not to bother Robb with it. Their father is in the south, Luwin reminds Bran, not the north, and Asha's stories are likely little more than another version of Old Nan's tales.
And so, Bran never delivers Asha's warning to his brother, and 2 days after the Karstarks arrived, Robb sets out with his army of 12,000 Northmen and Grey Wind at his side. 3-year-old Rickon had screamed and refused to leave his chamber for another farewell. And so 8-year-old Bran, alone of his family, took his leave of Robb, who told him, "You are the Lord in Winterfell now. You must take my place, as I took father's, until we come home." Bran was, understandably, frightened. He didn't know how to be a lord and had never received the training his brother no doubt had from his earliest days. Furthermore, his injury prevented him from performing basic tasks, which made him feel even more small and scared and inadequate.
And to top it off, as Robb rode off beneath the portcullis, Bran remembered Asha's warning and found himself wanting to call his brother back. But the moment passed, and Bran was left alone at Winterfell with the women and children and the few men, mostly old, who hadn't left with his father or his brother. And of course, Hodor. It says, the huge stable boy had a lost and frightened look to his face. And then, Hodor, he said sadly. Hodor, Bran agreed, wondering what it meant.
With Robb's departure, the build-up to the war that would eventually become the War of the Five Kings ends, and the action moves south with Robb, as seen from Catelyn's POV, because in spite of Robb's assurances, Catelyn did not return to her two younger sons at Winterfell, though she would send Sir Roderick Cassel in her place. And so Bran's melancholy days would continue until the fateful day some 6 weeks later when he and his little brother Rickon learned the true meaning of loss. I dreamed about the crow again last night, the one with 3 eyes. He flew into my bedchamber and told me to come with him, so I did. We went down to the crypts. Father was there and we talked. He was sad.
When Bran's mother left the Eyrie, she took ship from Gulltown to White Harbor, still in the company of Sir Roderick Cassel. At White Harbor, she joined the levy of Manderley men heading west to meet Robb at Moat Cailin, while Sir Roderick made his way back to Winterfell. Once there, he commenced training a new batch of guardsmen for the castle walls, necessary since most of the trained men had left with either Ned or Robb. The new recruits were likely village boys, mostly aged 16 or younger, and the scene strongly prefigures one George would write many years later as Sir Duncan the Tall trained village recruits in the Reach at Sir Eustace Osgree's Tower House.
Watching the woefully unskilled youths training from Maester Luwin's tower, Bran is once again feeling resentful at his own inability to participate, very similar to watching Rickon playing with the wolves at the beginning of Bran IV. As Bran talks to Luwin about the various nights from his boyhood dreams of glory, the old Maester tells him he must put those dreams aside, which reminds Bran of a dream he had the night before.
It was, he tells Luwin, the crow again, which of course indicates that he's told Luwin about his earlier nocturnal encounters with the three-eyed crow. In the dream, the crow told Bran to follow him and proceeded to lead him into the crypts below Winterfell. There they found Ned, and Bran says, "We talked. He was sad." Luwin, who was observing a comet in the sky with his Mirish lens, was clearly distracted, but he did ask why Ned was sad in the dream. Bran wasn't quite sure, but he thought it had something to do with Jon, a critical hint that Ned had some knowledge he regretted not sharing with Jon Snow. Importantly, Bran says that when he woke up, he had asked Hodor to take him into the crypts, but Hodor refused. Hearing how Bran's dream had bled into his reality finally got Luwin's attention.
He queries Bran about why he would want to go to the crypts, and Bran's reply indicates how much stock he now puts into his dreams of the three-eyed crow. "I told you, to look for father." Luwin attempts to reassure his young charge that Lord Eddard would not be found in the crypts for many years, gods be good, but Bran stubbornly insisted that he had been there the night before and that he had spoken with him. Realizing that Bran would not rest until he had visited the crypts in his waking hours, Luwin agrees to organize a trip below.
In place of Hodor, who could not be prevailed upon to enter the dark stairwell leading into the depths, Luwin summoned Asha from the kitchens. Luwin led the way with a torch, and Asha followed with Bran in her arms and Summer at their side. Bran recalls playing in the crypts with his siblings, a memory also shared by his sister Arya in just the previous chapter as she hid in the depths of the Red Keep after Ned's arrest.
to pass the time as they made their way down the long corridor of tombs towards the space at the end that lay in wait for Ned and the future lords of Winterfell when their time came. Bran tells Osha about the history of the Starks. What follows is a great deal of exposition about the kings of winter, the lords of Winterfell since the conquest, and the crypts themselves, which are described as longer than Winterfell itself, implying that perhaps some portion of the vaulted area may lie outside the walls of the castle.
Approaching the end of the row of tombs, Bran describes the statues of his father's siblings, Brandon and Lyanna. They're not supposed to have statues. That's only for the lords and kings, but my father loved them so much he had them done. Bran reveals that his understanding of what happened with Lyanna is limited to the official story that would have been told by King Robert, that Lyanna was abducted by Prince Rhaegar and died before Robert could get her back, in spite of his having killed Rhaegar at the Trident. Osha agrees it's a sad story, but says that she thinks the empty tombs are even sadder.
That, Lewin says, is for Lord Eddard when his time comes, and he then asks Bran if this is where he had seen his father in his dream. As Bran agrees, he starts to feel the presence of someone else, even as Lewin attempts to prove that the tomb is empty, and that's when the angry black direwolf sprang at the maester.
Shaggy Dog had been chained in the kennels before Robb left, after he had savaged Mikken and Farlan when they discovered Rickon hiding in this exact same place after he had run away upon hearing that Robb was leaving. It turns out that Rickon, having had the same dream that Bran had of their father waiting in the crypts to talk to them, had unchained his wolf and made his way into the underground vault alone. As we mentioned previously, only Robb and Grey Wind had been able to bring the Black Wolf to heel. And now it was Summer who came running, knocking his brother away, but not before Lewin's arm had been torn bloody.
Once the chaos had subsided somewhat, Rickon was revealed to be hiding in the crypt meant for his father, teary-eyed and demanding the others, "Let my father be." When Bran tells him that father isn't there, Rickon insists that he is, that he saw him in his dreams the night before, and that Ned had promised him that he was coming home. Rickon further stated that he was going to wait right there for Ned, and it was only Bran telling him that they could all, including the wolves, wait together in Lewin's tower that convinced Rickon to leave the crypts.
Back above ground, the group returned to Lewin's turret to wait, and although it's not specified exactly what they're waiting for, the reader knows what's coming. As Osha helped him bandage his arm, Lewin tells the boys that, while it is strange that they had the same dream, it might be perfectly natural. Both children miss their parents, and so longing for their presence is to be expected. As Lewin tries to convince Bran that dreams are only dreams, Osha interjects. Some are, some aren't. The children of the forest could tell you a thing or two about dreaming.
This leads to a discussion of some of Bran's favourite topics, the children of the forest, old Nan's stories, and magic, and Lewin is reduced to agreeing that the children knew magic while also warning Bran, "The man who trusts in spells is duelling with a glass sword." He then produces a jar of obsidian arrowheads to show the two boys. He tells them how thousands of years ago the children of the forest used obsidian-tipped arrows and obsidian blades and wore armour made of leaves and bark so that they were ever camouflaged in their forests.
Osha's in agreement, but her contribution, as ever, is to insist that things are very different beyond the wall, and that there the children still do all of the things Lewin is describing. Lewin then spends several paragraphs of exposition about the history of the children. Lewin, in fact, was one of our best sources of knowledge on the original inhabitants of Westeros prior to the release of the World Book. Osha's response to Lewin is once again agreement paired with insisting that things are different where she comes from. North of the wall, things are different. That's where the children went, and the giants, and the other old races.
An exasperated Lewin was reluctantly telling the boys about the Andal invasion, which goes a long way toward explaining Osha's position when they're interrupted by the wolves beginning to howl. It says then that dread clutched at Bran's heart, and he whispered aloud, "It's coming." He had known because the three-eyed crow had told him the night before, but he had wanted to believe Lewin's placatory explanations. But the raven that landed on the maester's windowsill told the tale as well as if he had spoken it aloud.
And it wasn't just Bran who knew. It says Rickon began to cry, while Lewin stared at the black bird as if it were a scorpion with feathers. When Bran asks him what the message says, it's Asha who gently puts her hand on his head and tells him, "You know what it is, boy." A moment later, Lewin acknowledges that what they had all been dreading without truly admitting it had come to pass. Rather than state the obvious, it says, "My lords," he said to the sons in a voice gone hoarse and shrunken, we shall need to find a stone carver who knew his likeness well."
Thus ends Bran's arc in A Game of Thrones. The death of his father is the outward confirmation that Bran's mentor going forward will not be the one he started with, and clears the way for his journey to gaining the knowledge and talents needed for him to complete his arc, which in classic form will involve leaving home to seek something, acquiring a mentor, exceeding the mentor, and finally returning home. There's another classic literary form that can be applied to Bran's story, and that is the former that Kurt Vonnegut referred to as man in whole.
In a man in whole story, the main character begins the narrative on a high. Life is good and problems seem far away. This is exactly what we've seen with Bran until midway through his second chapter. With his literal fall from the tower, we then see Bran's life slowly unravel. He himself is physically changed, but he also experiences the repeated loss of family and friends, some of which are permanent and some of which appear to be only temporary.
The second act of the man in whole story form generally begins when the character has reached rock bottom, the proverbial hole, and life is about as bad as it can be. Only then can he begin his climb back upwards towards an ending that in most cases will leave the character in a better position than he started, though much changed. Paired with the hero's journey, this story form is particularly compelling and promises many exciting things to come in Bran's future. As we'll see when we return with part 2 of this analysis, however, although the death of his father might seem like a low point, and from the perspective of the hero's journey, it does indeed signal the character's readiness to continue his arc in an upward direction, Bran hasn't truly landed in the hole yet. A Clash of Kings will have more tragedy in store for House Stark and surprises for Bran. We look forward to bringing that story to light in the next installment.
Thanks so much for joining us today. As usual, we'll end the episode by giving credit where credit is due. Thanks to George R.R. Martin for Summer Snows and to Kevin MacLeod for allowing us to use his music in our production. And we want to thank our patrons from the Castle Steel level. If you enjoy the podcast, consider being a patron and you could be hearing your name here too. Our heartfelt thanks to Atori Loon, AJ, Egg on the Sixth, Alex, Allie B, Casey, Cassandra, Charitable Rereadings, Lady Amalthea, Chris, Christian, Sir Clint Deandle, Convenience or Death, Courtney, David, Darian, Dimitri B, Dennis, Lady Diana Dane, Esme, Liza, Emily of the Erie, Ezra, Felix, Gerald Garcia, Sir Gladworth, Sir Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Ingvild, Jim McGeehan, Something Like a Lawyer, Winter's King, Red Jimba Rivers, John Aris, Rider of the Ice Dragon, Sonarion, The White Storm, Arafinwi and Glorian, Judson, Katie, Kenneth, Tree Girl, Sir Galahoo of What, Kyle, Anne Hayden Jones and her husband Pip, Lena Snow, known as the Twilight Star, Lemba, Lynn, Lomas Knight Rider, survivor of the Yeen Sleepover, Lord Leighton with the Highest Tower, Mage Marmot, Monero Geek TV, Maria, Margareta, and our cohort of Matts, Matt A, Matt C, Matt K, Matt L, Matt M, Matt R, as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Maester Mary, Molly, Nimble Nick One Iric, Peter Pebble, Peter, PJ, Paul B, Paul H, King Ray, first of his name, Richard, Rickle Pickle, Sam, Sir Swift the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sir Larcelot of B Hill, Cern, the Rat Chef de Cuisine, the Peppered Knight, Terry, Sir Terrence, Knight of the Cedars, Steph Lioness, Valen Valentine, Maiden of the Black Frost, Vince, Quarren Halfhand, and Yvonne. As always, let us know if I've pronounced any of your names wrong, if you have a nickname you'd prefer to use, or if you feel we've left anything out. Visit RadioWesteros.com for quick access to all our podcasts. You can also find a link to our Patreon campaign, donate via PayPal or Ko-fi, and comment on our content there. Or find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you find your podcasts. And of course, you can connect with us via Instagram, Discord, email, and now Blue Sky. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon with a new episode. Bye for now.